Nobody painted the scene. Not Moses, not any of the writers who came after him. Genesis 3 gives you a garden, a serpent, a woman, a man, and a piece of fruit. That is all it gives you. No color, no shape, no name. The text is almost deliberately sparse, as if the author knew that the object itself was not the point. And yet somehow, across 15 centuries of Western civilization, a single image calcified into fact, round, red, an apple, so thoroughly embedded in Christian imagination that it appears on church windows, in children's Bibles, in Renaissance frescoes, in the logo of one of the most valuable companies in human history. The Bible never said apple, not once. The word used in the original Hebrew text of Genesis is peri. It means fruit, any fruit, every fruit. It is the same generic word used in Genesis 1 when God says, "Let the earth bring forth fruit-bearing trees." It is not specific. It was never specific. The specificity came from somewhere else entirely. Here is where it gets interesting. Around 400 AD, a scholar named Jerome produced a Latin translation of the Bible that would become the dominant text of Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. It is called the Vulgate. Jerome was brilliant, meticulous, and working under enormous pressure to produce something the Latin-speaking church could use. In Genesis 3, he translated the Hebrew peri, that generic, unspecified fruit, with the Latin word malum. Malum in Latin means evil. It also means apple. Same word, two meanings. Jerome almost certainly chose it for theological resonance, the fruit of the knowledge of good and malum, good and evil. But Latin readers encountered that word and heard something else underneath it, apple, the forbidden apple, the apple of evil. The meanings collapsed into each other across centuries of repetition until the image became inseparable from the story. By the time painters like Cranach and Michelangelo rendered the scene, the apple was already assumed. Art locked what translation had suggested. And once an image achieves that kind of cultural saturation, it is almost impossible to see through it. But the Hebrew is still there. And the Hebrew is doing something completely different. Genesis 3 does not care what the fruit looked like. The text is not interested in that. What it is interested in is the tree, specifically what the tree is called. Etz hadat tov v'era, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That phrase carries the weight of the entire narrative. In Hebrew, the word "a" means knowledge, but not the kind of knowledge you get from reading. It is intimate knowledge, experiential knowledge. The same word used when Genesis says that Adam knew his wife. It is the knowledge that comes from direct contact with something, from being inside it rather than observing it from outside. The tree is not offering information. It is offering participation. That distinction is everything. The serpent says to the woman that eating will make them like God, knowing good and evil. The Hebrew construction there, yadei tov v'era, uses a participle form suggesting ongoing, lived experience, not a moment of enlightenment, an entry into a mode of being. What the man and woman reached for was not forbidden knowledge, in the sense of classified information. It was the experiential authority to determine for themselves what good and evil mean, to step outside a received moral order and become the source of their own moral framework. The fruit is not the point. The claim is the point. And here is what gets buried under 16 centuries of apple imagery. The text never says they ate the wrong thing. It says they took the wrong position. They were not punished for satisfying curiosity. They were not punished for disobedience in a simple rule-breaking sense. The Hebrew narrative structures the event as a kind of ontological overreach, a creature claiming the defining prerogative of the Creator. That is a very different story than the one the apple tells. The apple story is about temptation resisted or failed. It is about a piece of fruit and a bad decision in a garden. It is moral and manageable, and it fits neatly onto a stained glass window. The peri story, the actual Hebrew story, is about the human impulse to be the final authority over reality, to stand at the center of your own moral universe and declare what is good and what is evil from the inside out. That story is not contained in any garden. It is still happening. The curiosity gap the text opens is not about what fruit grew in Eden. It never was. The gap is about what it means to know, and what it costs to know in the wrong direction. Pull back for a moment and look at what has been established. A generic Hebrew word peri became a Latin word with a double meaning, malum, which became a painting, which became a symbol, which became so embedded in Western imagination that most Christians today carry a mental image the Bible never produced. The image is not harmless. It redirects attention. It turns a theological statement about human nature into a story about a piece of fruit and a bad afternoon in a garden. It shrinks the narrative, and something important gets lost in that shrinking. The Hebrew story is not primarily about failure. It is about orientation, about which direction the self is pointed when it reaches for authority over meaning. The tree of intimate, participatory knowledge sits at the center of the garden as a kind of test, not of obedience in a legalistic sense, but of trust. Will the creature accept that some knowledge is not yet theirs to hold? Will it remain inside a received order? Or will it step outside that order and appoint itself the measure of things? That question does not belong to the 3rd chapter of Genesis alone. It belongs to every moment a person decides what is right, based entirely on what feels right to them. Every moment a community reshapes its moral framework to match its preferences rather than submitting its preferences to examination. Every generation that reads ancient texts and quietly decides which parts still apply and which parts were just cultural artifacts of a less enlightened time. The overreach is not ancient. The overreach is structural. It is built into the way human beings relate to authority, to meaning, to each other. You have done this, so have I, so has everyone. That is not a condemnation. That is an observation about the texture of human experience. The Hebrew author was mapping with enormous precision, using the sparest possible language. More than 3,000 years ago, what does a correct orientation look like in the same text? Go back to Genesis 2. Before the tree becomes the center of the scene, the man is placed in the garden liovda al shamra, to serve it and to guard it. Both Hebrew verbs carry a sense of active, humble custodianship, not ownership, not authority. Stewardship under someone else's authority. The posture of someone who knows the garden belongs to another and tends it accordingly. The contrast the text is drawing is not between good people and bad people. It is between two orientations of the self, one that holds things loosely, as a steward, and one that grasps at the center, as an owner. That is the pattern. Steward or owner, receiver or claimant. The fruit was simply the moment the second orientation expressed itself. Now consider what this means for how you read your own life, not as a devotional exercise, as an honest one. Where are the places you have quietly appointed yourself the final authority over a relationship, over a moral question, over what God owes you or does not owe you? Where have you reached for the intimate, participatory knowledge of good and evil, and decided that your experience of something is enough to settle its meaning permanently? The question is not comfortable. It is not meant to be. The Hebrew author did not write Genesis 3 to make you feel better about human nature. They wrote it to show you something true about it, with enough precision that it would still be recognizable thousands of years later, in a different language, in a different world, in a life that looks nothing like a garden. Somewhere, right now, a person is reaching for something they were not yet given permission to hold, trying to know, in the deepest Hebrew sense, something that was meant to be received rather than seized. Maybe it is you. Maybe it is someone you love. The tree is still there. The question it raises has never changed. If this kind of deep, slow reading of Scripture is something you want more of, subscribe and stay close. Share this with someone who reads the Bible carefully. They will have thoughts. And if something in this unsettled you, leave it in the comments. We read them.